the House and who is not in the House. Thank you.
Alors, reprise le débat.
Resuming debate.
Calgary Forest Lawn.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In the last few weeks, I have received phone calls from constituents asking me why it came to this. How is it that Canada, the true north, strong and free, has come to declare a national emergency to handle trucks parked in downtown Ottawa? Let me be clear. It is time that the rule of law was restored in Ottawa, but what happened is a direct result of the fear and division of this Prime Minister. I also want to tell the people who are a part of the convoy that my colleagues and I have heard your valid concerns on this side of the House. We will continue to push for an end to pandemic measures as the science indicates they should. People have reached out to my office in the last 3 weeks and they're exhausted. They are frustrated. They are tired of this Liberal government not listening or even trying to understand their point of view. After 3 weeks, law enforcement acted to resolve the situation. However, there was no attempt by the government to speak to the organizers. Instead, the Prime Minister continued to throw around divisive rhetoric and still hasn't provided a plan forward to end the COVID-19 measures. This past Monday, the Liberals had an opportunity to finally show some leadership and support the thoughtful and measured motion that we Conservatives brought forward. But, as usual, they partnered with the NDP and crushed the hopes of countless Canadians desperate for a pathway out of the pandemic. Crushed the hopes of many of my constituents who are in industries like tourism and transportation, who were just looking for a path forward. Instead of working with members in this House and provincial governments, the Prime Minister dug in with his name-calling. The people outside West Block who are asking to be heard are just as Canadian as any member here. They should not be put down by someone who is supposed to be leading our country. Madam Speaker, we have now reached a point where we need to ask ourselves seriously if the use of the Emergencies Act was really necessary. The City of Ottawa had a state of emergency in effect, and the Ontario provincial government also declared an emergency. Under current powers that existed in those declarations and existing federal and provincial laws, the police had the tools they needed to handle the situation in Ottawa. The Emergencies Act clearly states that a declaration can only be made when it meets 3 conditions, including that no other federal law or provincial powers can deal with the alleged emergency. On top of that, Ontario has a plan to share law enforcement resources between municipalities without using the Emergencies Act. If the police already had the powers they needed, and the Emergencies Act wasn't necessary to get manpower, why invoke the Act for the first time in Canada's history? The Act was not used for the Oka crisis, not for either the Vancouver riots in 1994 or 2011. It wasn't used in 2010 when protesters at the G20 in Toronto started a riot. This Act hasn't even been used to address recent terrorist threats to Canada or the 2020 pipeline blockades. This government is setting an extremely dangerous precedent by invoking this act. The powers to deal with the situation here in Ottawa already existed. Despite what various ministers have said, the governor in council can direct the RCMP. It's all laid out in the RCMP Act under Section 5. This government should know because they used it in 2017. They also claimed that they needed the Emergencies Act to direct tow trucks in clearing rigs from downtown. Well, we know that is false too, because Section 129B of the Criminal Code gives police the option to require anyone without reasonable excuse to assist a public officer or peace officer in the execution of his duty in arresting a person or in preserving the peace. What's clear now is that invoking this act is just another power grab and overreach by this Liberal government. And that's scary. What happens in the future when a government doesn't agree with the political position of protesters in Canada? My constituents look at the emergency declaration and ask why. How can this Prime Minister equate truckers parked in the middle of the road in downtown Ottawa to World War I, World War II, and the October crisis simply because he disagrees with truckers' beliefs? He could have listened. He could have provided a plan forward out of the COVID measures. He could have handled the situation here in Ottawa without jeopardizing democracy. The RCMP and local law enforcement did it in BC, at Coots, Emerson, and the Ambassador Bridge. The Emergencies Act is not something we can throw around lightly. It is the absolute last choice when all else has failed, and the future of our country is at stake. The Liberal government and Prime Minister still can't explain what the steps before invoking this act were. When a national emergency is so urgent and dangerous, the government needs extraordinary powers. So where is that emergency? No matter what political stripe, supporting these sweeping powers is one of the most serious decisions a member of this House can make. It is serious because the use of the Emergencies Act impacts the rights and freedoms of Canadians, regardless of what this government says. Madam Speaker, this Prime Minister loves to throw lines around like responsible leadership. What leadership looks like is standing up for the rights and freedoms of this country. Real leadership is protecting the fundamental principles of Canada and uniting Canadians. Despite someone having different views than the Prime Minister, the government should not have the power to limit people's rights. Limiting rights should never happen without due process or an urgent national emergency. So if we don't have a critical national emergency, then the only way to limit a Canadian's rights should be through due process. Yet this government is now using the act to shut down people's bank accounts. The Deputy Director of Intelligence for FinTrack, Barry McKillop, said that there is no evidence that this funding in Ottawa is tied to ideologically motivated extremism. So why are people's judicial rights being shut down? Is the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty just something this government would ignore? Bank accounts are tied to people's lives and livelihoods. A person's support of a political protest should never be a reason to interfere with Canadians' rights. Howard Engel, former Deputy Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, wrote, quote, "The bottom line is that civil liberties in Canada are more vulnerable today than they were yesterday, and they will remain so as long as the declaration of emergency remains in place," end quote. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association has even taken legal action against the government, saying the Prime Minister's action invoking the act is extraordinary and unconstitutional. They go on to say that, quote, "legal requirements put in place to safeguard democratic processes have not been met," end quote. The Canadian Constitution Foundation has also said, quote, "emergency legislation should not be normalized. The threshold for using the Emergencies Act is extremely high and has not been met," end quote. The World Sikh Organization of Canada is also opposed to this act. So has the BC Civil Liberties Association. The provincial governments of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, Quebec, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta have also opposed the Prime Minister's overreach. The situation here in Ottawa never met the level of crisis that is needed to use the Emergencies Act. Invoking this act sets a dangerous precedent. It sends a message to all Canadians now and in the future that you cannot have dissenting opinions or views. In this time of fear and division, the people are crying out not to trample on the traditions and beliefs that make Canada great. This Prime Minister has had many opportunities to de-escalate the situation and take a measured approach. Conservatives have been calling on this government to lay out a clear plan following science. And again, the Liberal government has completely shut out Canadians, even though 2/3 of Canadians want to see these mandates gone. This is all about mandates, Madam Speaker. It's a time for leadership in this country to unite Canadians no matter what their views are. As members in this place, our first duty is to our constituents. Listen to them and protect their rights and freedoms. When the people in power overstep and overreact, we risk the rights, freedoms, and democracy that this place represents. This is why I cannot, in good conscience, support the use of the Emergencies Act. Now is the time for us in this House to stand up and find a way to return to a government who isn't divisive and find a way to unite Canadians. We need to work together to have a Canada united, strong, and free. Thank you, Madam Speaker.